Gee, this microphone so good.
You're on an airplane when you feel a sudden jolt. Outside your window, nothing seems to be happening, yet the plane continues to rattle you and your fellow passengers as it passes through turbulent air in the atmosphere. Although it may not comfort you to hear it, this phenomenon is one of the prevailing mysteries of physics. After more than a century of studying turbulence, we've only come up with a few answers for how it works and affects the world around us. And yet, turbulence is ubiquitous, springing up in virtually any system that has moving fluids. That includes the airflow in your respiratory tract, the blood moving through your arteries, and the coffee in your cup as you stir it. Clouds are governed by turbulence, as are waves crashing along the shore, and the gusts of plasma in our sun. Understanding precisely how this phenomenon works would have a bearing on so many aspects of our lives. Here's what we do know. Liquids and gases usually have two types of motion: a laminar flow, which is stable and smooth, and a turbulent flow, which is composed of seemingly unorganized swirls. Imagine an incense stick. The laminar flow of unruffled smoke at the base is steady and easy to predict. Closer to the top, however, the smoke accelerates, becomes unstable, and the pattern of movement changes to something chaotic. That's turbulence in action, and turbulent flows have certain characteristics in common. Firstly, turbulence is always chaotic. That's different from being random. Rather, this means that turbulence is very sensitive to disruptions. A little nudge one way or the other will eventually turn into completely different results. That makes it nearly impossible to predict what will happen, even with a lot of information about the current state of a system. Another important characteristic of turbulence is the different scales of motion that these flows display. Turbulent flows have many differently sized whirls called eddies, which are like vortices of different sizes and shapes. All those differently sized eddies interact with each other, breaking up to become smaller and smaller until all that movement is transformed into heat in a process called the energy cascade. So that's how we recognize turbulence. But why does it happen? In every flowing liquid into turbulence, we measure where a flow falls on that spectrum with something called the Reynolds number, which is the ratio between a flow's inertia and its viscosity. The higher the Reynolds number, the more likely it is that turbulence will occur. Honey being poured into a cup, for example, has a Reynolds number of about 1. The same setup with water has a Reynolds number that's closer to 10,000. The Reynolds number is useful for understanding simple scenarios, but it's ineffective in many situations. For example, the motion of the atmosphere is significantly influenced by factors including gravity and the Earth's rotation. Or take relatively simple things like the drag on buildings and cars. We can model those thanks to many experiments and empirical evidence. But physicists want to be able to predict them through physical laws and equations, as well as we can model the orbits of planets or electromagnetic fields. Most scientists think that getting there will rely on statistics and increased
Từ kính VR thì
power.
vẫn nhìn thấy được cái màn hình,
Extremely
nhưng mà nó
high-speed
kèm theo
computer
cả cái
simulations of turbulent flows could help us
kiểu như
identify
là cái
patterns
không gian xung
that
quanh
could
nữa
lead
thì
to a
nhìn nó mới
theory
vui.
that
Chứ
organizes
còn
and
stream
unifies
mỗi màn hình
predictions
không thì quá bình
across
thường.
different situations.
Nhưng mà tiếc là không stream
Other
được.
scientists think that the
Chưa tìm được
phenomenon
cách.
is so complex that such
Nếu
a
mà stream bằng
full-fledged
ấy thì
theory
có thể
isn't
dùng
ever going to be possible. Hopefully we'll reach a breakthrough because a
dùng
true
kính không cần dùng tay
understanding
cầm nhưng mà vẫn dùng bàn phím để chơi bình thường. Để nhìn màn hình nó phê hơn thôi.
More efficient wind farms, the ability to better prepare for catastrophic weather events, or even the power to manipulate hurricanes
Màn hình trong nhìn phê vãi lều.
and of course, smoother rides for millions of airline passengers. Despite how difficult it is to explain turbulence mathematically, Vincent van Gogh
từ này
When
gì
we
đây?
hear the word radiation,
À,
it's tempting to picture huge explosions and frightening mutations. But that's not the full story. Radiation also applies to
Chí.
rainbows and a doctor examining an
Cái mic của
X-ray.
cái quest này có vẻ là ngon
So
hơn cái mic
what
kia.
is radiation really? And how
Khá
much
là
should
đỉnh.
we worry about its effects? The answer begins with understanding that the word radiation describes two very different scientific phenomena: electromagnetic radiation and nuclear radiation. Electromagnetic radiation is pure energy consisting of interacting oscillating through space. As the waves oscillate faster, they scale up. At the lower end of the spectrum, at the higher end are ultraviolet, X-ray. Modern society is
Đủ
shaped
trâu vậy
by
sao?
sending and detecting electromagnetic radiation. We might download an email to
À,
our phone
nghe
via
ZS thôi
radio
mà, đi
waves
đâu.
to open an image of an X-ray, which we can see because our screen. Nuclear radiation, on the other hand, where protons repel struggle to overcome this repulsion. Some remain they will randomly eject matter a gas which seeps up from the
Damn. Tiếng tòng á.
This is known as ionizing radiation, because an atom electrons is always on. All nuclear radiation is ionizing, while only the highest energy electromagnetic radiation is. That includes gamma, X-rays, and the high energy end of ultraviolet. That's why, during X-rays, doctors shield body parts they need to examine. And beachgoers and sunscreen. In comparison, cellphones and microwaves operate at the lower end of the spectrum, so there is no risk of ionizing radiation. The biggest health risk occurs when lots of ionizing radiation hits us in short, also known as an acute exposure. Acute exposure will overwhelm the body's natural ability. This can trigger cancers, cellular dysfunction, and potentially even death. Fortunately, acute exposure is rare, but we are exposed daily to lower levels of ionizing radiation from both natural and man-made sources. Scientists have a hard time quantifying these risks. Your body often repairs damage from small amounts of ionizing radiation, and if you can't, the results of damage. One way scientists compare ionizing radiation exposure is a unit called C. An acute exposure to one C will probably cause nausea within hours, and cold
Lag quá nhờ.
However, our normal daily exposures are calm. The average person receives 6.2 millisieverts of radiation from all sources annually, around a third through the radon. At only 5 millisievers each, you need to get more than 1,200 dental X-rays to rack up your radiation dosage. And remember that minute. All the bananas radiation, you need around 170 a day to hit your annual dosage. We live in a world of radiation. However, much of that radiation is not.
Nỗi sợ.
For the remainder that is ionized, our exposures are usually low, and choices like getting your phone tested for radon and the sunscreen can help reduce the associated health risks. Marie Curie, one of the early radiation pioneers, summed up the challenge as follows: nothing in life is easy. It is only understood.
Ảo thật đấy.
Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less.
Này có to quá không nhỉ?
雷鳴に全ての罪を洗い流してもらいましょう。
Nói chung mà chơi thì cũng bình thường. Chơi ở trong mode VR thì bình thường. Cái lùm mí hand tracking nó cứ lôi cái chuột mình đi mất. Bộ hiện đại quá.
Consider the following sentence. This statement is false. Is that true? If so, that would make this statement false. But if it's false, then the statement is true. By referring to itself directly, this statement creates an unresolvable paradox. So if it's not true and it's not false, what is it? This question might seem like a silly thought experiment, but in the early 20th century, it led Austrian logician Kurt Gödel to a discovery that would change mathematics forever. Gödel's discovery had to do with the limitations of mathematical proofs. A proof is a logical argument that demonstrates why a statement about numbers is true. The building blocks of these arguments are called axioms, undeniable statements about the numbers involved. Every system built on mathematics, from the most complex proof to basic arithmetic, is constructed from axioms. And if a statement about numbers is true, mathematicians should be able to confirm it with an axiomatic proof. Since ancient Greece, mathematicians don't typically talk about themselves. A mathematical statement is simply true or false, but Gödel had an idea. First, he translated mathematical statements and equations into code numbers so that a complex mathematical idea could be expressed in a single number. This meant that mathematical statements written with those numbers were also expressing something about the encoded statements of mathematics. In this way, the coding allowed mathematics to talk about itself. Through this method, he was able to write "this statement cannot be proved" as an equation, creating the first self-referential mathematical statement. However, unlike the ambiguous sentence that inspired him, mathematical statements must be true or false. So, which is it? If it's false, that means the statement does have a proof. But if a mathematical statement has a proof, then it must be true. This contradiction means that Gödel's statement can't be false, and therefore, it must be true that this statement cannot be proved. Yet this result is even more surprising because it means we now have a true equation of mathematics that asserts it cannot be proved. This revelation is at the heart of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which introduces an entirely new class of mathematical statement. In Gödel's paradigm, statements still are either true or false, but true statements can either be provable or unprovable within a given set of axioms. Furthermore, Gödel argues these unprovably true statements exist in every axiomatic system. This makes it impossible to create a perfectly complete system using mathematics, because there will always be true statements we cannot prove. Even if you account for these unprovable statements by adding them as new axioms to an enlarged mathematical system, that very process introduces new, unprovably true statements. No matter how many axioms you add, there will always be unprovably true statements in your system. It's Gödel's all the way down. This revelation rocked the foundations of the field, crushing those who dreamed that every mathematical claim would one day be proven or disproven. While most mathematicians accepted this new reality, some fervently debated it. Others still tried to ignore the newly uncovered hole in the heart of their field. But as more classical problems were proven to be unprovably true, some began to worry their life's work would be impossible to complete. Still, Gödel's theorem opened as many doors as it closed. Knowledge of unprovably true statements inspired key innovations in early computers. And today, some mathematicians dedicate their careers to identifying provably unprovable statements. So while mathematicians may have lost some certainty, thanks to Gödel, they can embrace the unknown at the heart of any quest for truth.
The Pythagorean theorem has more than 350 proofs.
So what exactly is this mathematical rule about? How was it proven in the first place? Explore one of the cornerstones of geometry with this video.
An elderly woman named Rosalie was sitting in her nursing home when her room suddenly burst to life with twirling fabrics. Through the elaborate drapings, she could make out animals, children, and costume characters. Rosalie was alarmed not by the intrusion, but because she knew this entourage was an extremely detailed hallucination. Her cognitive function was excellent, and she had not taken any medications that might cause hallucinations. Strangest of all, when a real-life crowd of circus performers burst into her room, she wouldn't have been able to see them. She was completely blind. Rosalie had developed a condition known as Charles Bonnet syndrome, in which patients with either impaired vision or total blindness suddenly hallucinate whole scenes in vivid color. These hallucinations appear suddenly and can last for mere minutes or recur for years. We still don't fully understand what causes them to come and go, or why certain patients develop them when others don't. We do know from fMRI studies that these hallucinations activate the same brain areas as sight, areas that are not activated by imagination. Many other hallucinations, including smells, sights, and sounds, also involve the same brain areas as real sensory experiences. Because of this, the cerebral cortex is thought to play a part in hallucinations. This thin layer of gray matter covers the entire cerebrum, with different areas processing information from each of our senses. But even in people with completely unimpaired senses, the brain constructs the world we perceive from incomplete information. For example, our eyes have blind spots where the optic nerve blocks part of the retina. When the visual cortex processes light into coherent images, it fills in these blind spots with information from the surrounding area. Occasionally, we might notice a glitch, but most of the time, we're none the wiser. When the visual cortex is deprived of input from the eyes, even temporarily, the brain still tries to create a coherent picture, but the limits of its abilities become a lot more obvious. The full-blown hallucinations of Charles Bonnet syndrome are one example. Because Charles Bonnet syndrome only occurs in people who had normal vision and then lost their sight, not those who were born blind, scientists think the brain uses remembered images to compensate for the lack of new visual input. And the same is true for other senses. People with hearing loss often hallucinate music or voices, sometimes as elaborate as the cacophony of an entire marching band. In addition to sensory deprivation, recreational and therapeutic drugs, conditions like epilepsy and narcolepsy, and psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia are a few of the many known causes of hallucinations, and we're still finding new ones. Some of the most notorious hallucinations are associated with drugs like LSD and psilocybin. Their hallmark effects include the sensation that dry objects are wet and that surfaces are breathing. At higher doses, the visual world can appear to melt, dissolve into swirls, or burst into fractal-like patterns. Evidence suggests these drugs also act on the cerebral cortex. Activate receptors in a broad range of brain areas, including the cortical regions for all the senses. LSD and psilocybin both function like serotonin in the brain, binding directly to one type of serotonin receptor in particular. While serotonin's role in the brain is complex and poorly understood, it likely plays an important part in integrating information from the eyes, nose, ears, and other sensory organs. So one theory is that LSD and psilocybin cause hallucinations by disrupting the signaling involved in sensory integration. Hallucinations associated with schizophrenia may share a similar mechanism with those caused by LSD and psilocybin. Patients with schizophrenia often have elevated levels of serotonin in the brain, and antipsychotic drugs relieve symptoms of schizophrenia, by
Ờ,
blocking the
đẹp quá.
same serotonin receptors LSD and psilocybin bind to. And in some
chung là dùng cái
cases,
kính kia
these
thì khá là
drugs can
hay.
even relieve the
Cảm giác
hallucinations of patients with
chơi hon
Charles
cai không
Bonnet
thì nó hơi
syndrome.
thấy mắt.
We're still a long way from understanding all the different causes and interconnected mechanisms of
Nên
hallucinations.
là không ai
But
chơi
it's
ấy
clear
à.
that hallucinatory experiences are much more
Ủa,
closely
HT đâu?
tied to ordinary perception than we once thought. And by studying hallucinations, we stand to learn a great deal about how our brains construct the world we see, hear, smell, and touch. As we learn more, we'll likely come to appreciate just how subjective and individual each person's island universe of perception really is. Want to keep exploring this subject? We recommend Oliver Sacks' Hallucinations. This book includes jaw-dropping personal accounts of a range of sensory disturbances, including mysterious voices, non-existent visitors, and even Kermit the Frog? You can download an audiobook version for free at audible.com/TEDED.
Nghe tiếng Anh mới giỏi chứ. Lon thế. Thì nghe mới được chứ.
As dawn broke over Paris on August 21st, 1911, Vincenzo Perugia hoisted a painting off the wall and slipped down the back stairs of the Louvre. He was close to freedom, the exit just before him, when he encountered a two-pronged problem. The door was locked and footsteps were approaching. Tucked under Perugia's arm was Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. It's arguably the world's most famous painting today. But how did it achieve its status? Leonardo is thought to have started the portrait in 1503 at the request of a Florentine businessman who wanted a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. Leonardo continued working on the painting for more than 10 years, but it was unfinished by the time he died. Over his lifetime, Leonardo conducted groundbreaking studies on human optics, which led him to pioneer certain artistic techniques. Some can be seen in the Mona Lisa. Using atmospheric perspective, he made images at greater distances easier, producing the illusion of profound depth. And with sfumato, he created subtle gradations between colors that softened the edges of the forms he depicted. All of this is striking, but is it enough to make the Mona Lisa the world's most famous painting? Many scholars consider it an outstanding Renaissance portrait, but one among plenty. And history is full of great paintings. Indeed, the Mona Lisa's rise to worldwide fame depended largely on factors beyond the canvas. King Francois I of France purchased the painting and began displaying it after Leonardo's death. Then, in 1550, Italian scholar Giorgio Vasari published a popular biography of Italian Renaissance artists, Leonardo included. The book was translated and distributed widely, and it contained a gushing description of the Mona Lisa as a hypnotic imitation of life. Over the years, the Mona Lisa became one of the most enviable pieces in the French royal collection. It hung in Napoleon's bedroom and eventually went on public display in the Louvre Museum. There, visitors flocked to see the once private treasures of the deposed aristocracy. During the 1800s, a series of European scholars further hyped the Mona Lisa up, fixating to a conspicuous degree on the subject's allure. In 1854, Alfred Dumesnil said that Mona Lisa's smile imparted a treacherous security. A year later, Théophile Gautier wrote of her mocking lips and gaze promising unknown pleasures. And in 1869, Walter Pater described Mona Lisa as the embodiment of timeless feminine beauty. By the 20th century, the portrait was an iconic piece in one of the world's most famous museums, but the Mona Lisa wasn't yet It was Perugia's 1911 heist that helped it skyrocket to unprecedented fame. Having been contracted to make protective cases for the Louvre, it wasn't totally inconceivable for Perugia to be locked inside the museum. And when a worker encountered him, he simply broke Perugia and let him walk out. The theft gathered
gì
to
đét?
see the blank space where the Mona Lisa
Đét
once
vậy liệu?
hung. The police interviewed
Vừa vào
Penn
thấy đét à?
because he had worked at the Louvre, but they never considered him a suspect. Meanwhile, they interrogated Pablo Picasso because of his connection to a previous Louvre theft, but eventually let him go. For 2 years, Perugia kept painting the false Pablo case and smuggled the Mona Lisa and sell it to a foreign team. Perugia saw himself as an Italian patriot, returning an old master's work. Instead of being celebrated as such, he was a media. With the mystery solved, the Mona Lisa went back on display for large crowds. Newspapers told the story more faithfully. In following decades, conceptual artist Marcel Duchamp Nat King Cole sang about it. Seagoers wielding stones, acid, and paint attacked him. More than 500 years after its creation, eyebrows and eyelashes long since faded. The Mona Lisa is protected by a bulletproof, earthquake-safe case. Now it stands less as an exemplary Renaissance portrait and more as a testament to how we live and maintain celebrity.
Căng.
The Mona Lisa is stolen one ancient art, but there's an artwork so ugly and influential that it's been hijacked over a dozen times, including once by Nazis. Get to know its high drama history, 6th century spanning story with this video.
Ồ, thấy sai nhỉ? Khúc đấy mà mình ulti official nhanh là được rồi.
So, after a great deal of scientific research, technological advancement, and persistence, we still don't have any answers, but we have some interesting theories. Our collection of which relate and psychological issues stemming from its
Rồi
repression
xong sai luôn.
addressed and resolved. We dream to remember. To increase performance on certain mental tasks, sleep is good, but dreaming while sleeping is better. In fact, researchers found that sleep is one better at getting through a complex 3-day
Khó đấy, khó để bắn vào cái tâm.
better at it than those who only thought of the maze while awake between those who learned but did not dream about the maze. Researchers realize that certain memory processes and our dreams are a signal that these processes are necessary ones. Without this unlocked process, which results parasitic thoughts could disrupt the necessary thinking about
のように輝きなさい。
Data.
long-term effects in order to function properly. So when
Anh
external
hiểu gì vậy?
input falls
勝利
below
の
a
外
certain
貨が
level,
響かん。
the brain automatically triggers the generation of data from its memory sources, which appear to you in the form of the thoughts and feelings you experience.
夜の権限
In other words, your dreams might be a blend of experiences.
ステージが始まるわ。
Dream to rehearse
Má mất quỷ tệ.
Dreams involving dangerous and threatening situations are very common, and the primitive instinct of holds that the content of a dream is significant to its purpose. Whether it's an anxiety-filled night with a chase by a bear, or fighting off a ninja in a dark alley, these dreams allow you to practice and fight or flight.
これがあなたのレクイエム。
Mẹ con không tên này.
Neurotransmitters in the brain
Kìa.
are much less active during the REM stage of sleep,
Ngược lớn.
even during dreams of
Nó hiểu kiểu gì?
some researchers have theorized that one purpose of dreaming is to take much off painful experiences.
Nổi hụt luôn.
Reviewing traumatic events in your dreams with less mental stress may
Như
grant you
hiểu.
a clearer perspective and in psychologically healthy ways. People with certain mood disorders and PTSD often have difficulty sleeping, leading some scientists to believe that lack of dreaming is a contributing factor to their illnesses.
ステージが始まるわ。
Research has demonstrated the effectiveness of dreaming on problem solving.
星が光り輝くわ。
Best solution to problem.
夜の権限。 勝利アンコール。来年の子。
Ngu rồi. Đéo hiểu kiểu gì. Rót đánh như nào ta?
勝利の外貨が響かん。震えなさい。犯罪の名において。来たの。夜の権限。
Socrates, one of the founding fathers of Western philosophical thought, was on trial. Many Athenians believed he was a dangerous enemy, accusing the philosopher of corrupting the youth and refusing to recognize their gods. However, Socrates
Oh my
wasn't
God.
feared for claiming to have all the answers, but rather for asking too many questions. While he loathed formal lectures, the philosopher frequently engaged friends and strangers in lengthy conversations about morality and society. These discussions weren't debates, nor would Socrates offer explicit advice. In fact, the philosopher often claimed to know nothing at all, responding to his partner's answers only with further questions. But through this process, Socrates probed their logic, revealing its
Oh,
flaws
shit.
and helping both parties reach a more robust understanding. These
Oh, shit, oh, shit,
insightful
oh, shit.
questions made Socrates beloved by his followers. Two of his students, Plato and Xenophon, were so inspired that they replicated their mentor's process in fictional
Oh, come on.
dialogues. These invented exchanges
Why
provide
it is
perfect
so hard,
examples
like,
of what would
advanced
come to be known as the Socratic method. In one of these fabricated dialogues, Socrates is conversing with a young man named Euthydemus, who is confident that he understands the nature of justice and injustice. Socrates probes the student's values by asking him to label actions such as lying and theft as just or unjust. Euthydemus confidently categorizes them as injustices, but this only prompts another question. Is it just for a general to deceive or pillage a hostile army? Euthydemus revises his assertion. He claims that these actions are just when done to enemies, and unjust when done to friends. But Socrates isn't finished. He asks the young man to consider a commander lying to his troops to boost their morale. Before long, Euthydemus is despondent. It seems that every answer leads to further problems, and perhaps he's not quite sure what constitutes
Oh, shit.
justice after
I
all.
made a mistake.
In employing this question-oriented approach, Socrates described himself as a midwife, whose inquiries assist others in giving birth to their ideas. His method of questioning draws out an individual's unexamined assumptions and then challenges those biases. It doesn't always provide definitive answers, but the method helps clarify questions and eliminate contradictory or circular logic. And by following a line
Oh my god, I'm so late.
logically leads, both the question asker and answerer can end up in unexpected places. This technique isn't limited by the conversation's content, making it incredibly useful in numerous fields. During the Renaissance, the method was used to teach clinical medicine, students proposing their rationale for different diagnoses, while a doctor questioned their assumptions and moderated discussion. In this model, the method could even produce conclusive results. This same approach was later used in other sciences, such as astronomy, botany, and mathematics. Following the Protestant Reformation, it was adapted to tackle abstract questions of faith. In the 19th century, the method became
Wow. I don't know what am I doing anymore.
American legal education. Professors explored students' understanding of judicial reasoning by challenging them with unforeseen hypothetical situations. This approach is still used today by the Supreme Court to imagine the unintended impacts of passing a law. The Socratic method can be adapted to teach almost any topic that relies on critical reasoning, but its success depends on the teacher employing it. An effective Socratic educator must be well versed in their subject. Rather than fooling their students or showing off their superior intellect, they should be honest, genuinely curious, and
What the fuck?
affirming of every contribution. In this regard, Socrates himself may not have been the most subtle Socratic teacher. Historians believe he was deeply critical of Athens' particular brand of democracy and known to pass those concerns on to his followers. These
Shit, where's my
subversive
damage?
beliefs
I
were
cannot
distorted
find
in
my
public
damage.
forums and thought to have inspired two of his pupils to treasonous ends. It was likely for these ideas Socrates
I'm
was
gonna
brought
clear
to
the
trial
mobs
and
then.
eventually sentenced
It's
to
easier
death.
to do so.
But even on his deathbed, artists depict a serene philosopher, ever curious
Fuck
to
Husk.
explore the ultimate question. What was life like in Socrates' Athens? Travel back in time to 427 BCE and experience how an ancient democracy made its decisions.
Sorry, my phone died. It's nothing. I'm fine. These allegations are completely unfounded. The company is not aware from medieval
Ủa sao còn con sống
devices
kìa?
to
What the
polygraphs,
hell?
blood pressure and breathing monitors, voice stress analyzers, eye trackers, infrared
Wait,
brain
I think
scanners,
that's
and
enough
even the
for
400-pound electroencephalogram. But although such tools have worked under certain circumstances, most can be fooled with enough preparation, and none are considered reliable enough
I'm
to
ahead
even be
to other
admissible in court.
accounts.
But what if the problem is not with the techniques, but the underlying assumption that lying spurs physiological changes? What if we took a more direct approach, using communication science to analyze the lies themselves? On a psychological level, we lie partly to paint a better picture of ourselves, connecting our fantasies to the person we wish we were, rather than the person we are. But while our brain is busy dreaming, it's letting plenty of signals slip by. Our conscious mind only controls about 5% of our cognitive function, including communication, while the other 95% occurs beyond our awareness. And according to the literature on reality monitoring, stories based on imagined experiences are qualitatively different from those based on real experiences. This suggests that creating a false story about a personal topic takes work and results in a different pattern of language use. A technology known as linguistic text analysis has helped to identify 4 such common patterns in the subconscious language of deception. First, liars reference themselves less when making deceptive statements. They write or talk more about others, often using the third person to distance and disassociate themselves from their lie, which sounds more false. Absolutely no party took place at this house, or I didn't host a party here. Second, liars tend to be more negative because on a subconscious level, they feel guilty about lying. For example, a liar might say something like, "Sorry, my stupid phone battery died. I hate that thing." Third, liars typically explain events in simple terms, since our brains struggle to build a complex lie. Judgment and evaluation are complex things for our brains to compute. As a US president once famously insisted, I did not have sexual relations with that. And finally, even though liars keep descriptions simple, they tend to use longer and more convoluted sentence structures, inserting unnecessary words and irrelevant factual sounding details about the lie. Another president confronted with the scandal proclaimed, "I can say categorically that this investigation indicates that no one on the White House, no one in this administration presently employed was involved in this very bizarre incident." Let's apply linguistic analysis to some famous examples. Take 7-time Tour de France winner Lance Armstrong. When comparing a 2005 interview in which he had denied taking performance to a 2013 interview in which he admitted his personal pronouns increased by nearly 3. Note the contrast between the following two quotes. First, okay, you know, a guy in a Parisian laboratory opens up a sample, Jean-Francois so-and-so. You test it, and then you get a phone call from a newspaper that says you found it to be positive 6 times for EUS.
Này so much đáng
I'm
xem
sure
mà.
there'll be other people that
Cái tích để xem clip sau.
and I was used to controlling everything in my life.
Đánh mỏ mẫm thế chán đời đó.
In his denial, Armstrong described a hypothetical scenario focused on someone else, removing himself from the situation entirely. In his admission, he owns his secrets, delving into his personal emotions and motivations. But the use of personal pronouns is just one indication. Let's look at another example from former Senator and U.S. presidential candidate John Edwards. I only know that the parent father has said publicly that he is the father of the baby. I also have not been engaged in any activity, requested, or supported payments of any kind related to the apparent father. Not only is that a pretty long-winded way to say the baby is mine, but Edwards never calls the other party by name, instead saying that baby is mine.
Damn.
Now let's see what he had to say.
Nó bắn phát chết con này em luôn.
I and twins, I will do everything in my power to provide her with the love and support she deserves. The statement is short and direct, calling the child by name and addressing his role. So how can you apply this lies? First, remember that many of the lies we encounter on a daily basis are far less serious
Đánh chết hai em luôn đấy.
and may even be harmless. But it's still worthwhile to be aware of telltale clues like minimal self-references, negative language, simple explanations, and convoluted phrasing. It just might help you avoid an overvalued stock, an ineffective product, or even a terrible relationship.
Đủ trâu phết đấy.
They're lovable. Judging by the trophies, bouncing, climbing, stalking, clawing, chattering, and purring. One thing is certain. Cats are very. These somewhat strange feline behaviors. Asking why did cats do that? Throughout time, cats were cited as solitary predators of smaller animals, larger carnivores. As both predators and predators, survival of their species depended on crucial instinctual behaviors, which we still observe in wild and domestic cats today. While the feline actions of your house cat Grizmo might seem perplexing, in the wild, these same behaviors, naturally bred into cats for millions of years, would make Grizmo a super cat. Enabled by their unique muscular structure and keen balancing abilities, cats climbed to high vantage points to survey their territory and spot prey in the wild.
What the
Grismo doesn't need these particular skills to find and hunt
Oh
down
my
dinner
God.
in her food bowl today. But the essential since most cat prey are small, cats and use pounce.
Damn, sao can I be honest?
This is why first to so one explanation for Gizmo's openings is curiosity that helps ensure the continuation of her species for millions of years needed sharp claws for climbing, hunting, and finding pets. Help stretch their back.
Damn. Rich people. No, they sen á. Tịch đâu. Mới sen đỏ thôi. Red Lotus.
In order to survive. As a wild, cats were the best at avoiding predators. Grismo is an expert at
But that.
clean and odor-free litter box. That's less likely to give away her location to any predators that may be sniffing around nearby. Considering everything we do know about cats,
Thì
it
tất nhiên là
seems
dễ
that
hơn
one of
hẳn
their
rồi.
most predominant behaviors is still one of the most mysterious. Cats may purr for any number of reasons,
Má đét.
such as happiness, stress, and hunger. But curiously, the frequency of their purrs
Echo of
between 25
Paradise.
and 150
Paradise.
hertz is within a range
Echo,
that
echo.
can promote tissue regeneration. So while her purring makes Grismo an excellent nap companion, it is also possible that her purr will muscles and bones, and maybe even yours too. It's both solitary cats today are the same that allow them to survive for millions of years. This explains then our homes are their jungles. But if this is the case, in our own cat's eyes, who
Oh, that's kind of stupid. Wow, so that.
勝利の外貨が響かん震えなさい散財の名において我が宿敵よ夜の源源野菜の雷今黄金のように輝きなさい
In the middle of the 16th century, a
This
talented
is stupid.
young
Oh my God.
anatomist
Where's my
named
QTE?
Andreas
Hiya.
Vesalius made a shocking
勝
discovery.
利の外貨
The
が
most
響かん
famous
震え
human
なさい
anatomy
姿を見
texts
せ
in
よま
the
ず
world were wrong. They not only failed to account for many
夜の
human
権限
body, they also described the organs of pigs and other animals. While Vesalius was right, announcing these areas would mean challenging Galen and Virgo, the most renowned physicians in medical research. But who was this towering figure, and why did doctors working more than 100 years later so revere and fear him?
影のカラ
Born
ス
in
優也を求めて
Galen left home as a Mediterranean for medical passion for anatomy and a penchant
So
for
I
showmanship.
lack up, but it didn't do
Gleefully
damage.
entered public anatomy contests, eager to
勝
show
利の
up
外
his
貨が
fellow
響かん
physicians.
震えなさい
In one demonstration, he caused a pig to lose its voice by tying off one of its
夜の
limbs.
権限
In another, he disemboweled a monkey and challenged his father to marry when they couldn't. One hand physician and surgeon to the city gladiator. Eventually, he would leave the arena to become a personal physician to 4 Roman emperors. While his peers debated symptoms in their origins, Galen obsessively studied anatomy. He was convinced that each organ had a specific function. Since the Roman government largely reported working with human cadavers, Galen conducted dissections of humans instead.
Thiếu tí đam
Even
gì.
with this constraint, his exhaustive investigations
We
yielded
are
some
lacking
remarkably
a little
accurate
bit of
conclusions.
damage here.
One of Galen's most important contributions was the insight that the brain, not the heart, controlled the body. He confirmed this theory by opening the cranium of a living cow. By applying pressure to different parts of the brain, he could link various regions to specific functions. Other experiments allowed him to distinguish sensory from motor nerves, establish that urine was made in the kidneys, and deduce that respiration was controlled by muscles and nerves. But these wild experiments also produced extraordinary misconceptions. Galen never realized that blood cycles continuously throughout the body. Instead, the liver constantly produces a supply of blood, which gets entirely depleted on its way to the organs. Galen also agreed with simplifying the popular theory of the fluids, introduced by the hypothesis. This misguided hypothesis attributed most medical problems to an imbalance in 4 bodily fluids.
Oh shit, no SB.
To correct the balance of these fluids, doctors employed dangerous treatments like bloodletting and
SB where?
purging. Informed by his
SB where?
poor understanding
SB
of the
where?
circulatory system, Galen was a strong proponent of these treatments, despite their sometimes lethal consequences. Unfortunately, Galen's ego drove him to believe that all his discoveries were of the utmost importance. He penned treatises on everything from anatomy to nutrition to the inside man, meticulously cataloging his writings to ensure their preservation. Over the next 13 centuries, Galen's prolific dominated all other styles of medical thought. His text became the standard works taught to new generations of doctors, who
Using,
in turn
this,
wrote new essays extolling Galen's
Cloudflare
ideas. Even
bow,
doctors who
where
actually
damage.
dissected human cadavers would bafflingly repeat Galen's mistakes, despite seeing clear evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, the few practitioners old enough to offer unclear were either ignored or ridiculed. For 1,300 years, Galen's legacy remained untouched until the Renaissance Americans considered themselves spoke out against it. As a prominent scientist and lecturer, his authority influenced many young doctors of his time. But even then, it took another 100 years for an accurate description of blood to emerge and to fade.
Cái lùm mí.
Hopefully, today we can reap the benefits of
Hãy sẽ hành động
Galen's
không đủ đâu.
experiments without attributing equal credence to his less accurate
Hành động nó không
ideas.
stuck.
But
Nó không
perhaps
stuck như Gen
just as
Z.
valuable is the reminder
Đấy là lý
that
do mà
science is
dùng
an
nó không ngon như ấy đâu.
ever-evolving
Tưởng
process
là ngon
which
mà.
should always place
Chê.
evidence above ego. For more on the history of medicine,
That's what's
enter
stuck.
ancient Egypt and
I'm trying
Dr.
Marguerite now.
Pesachet as she makes her daily rounds. During the middle of
What
World
the
War II,
fuck?
scientists cracked open the
Nó bảo là nó
nucleus
không
at the
stuck rồi thì
center of
3
the
set cũng
uranium
thế.
atom.
Nét vẫn trả lời ra.
Nuclear mass into
Nó không stuck là nó không dùng được nhiều set rồi.
They
They did this by creating for the first time a chain reaction inside the new Since then, the ability to mine great amounts of energy from uranium nuclei has led some to build nuclear
Wow,
power
this
as
damage
a plentiful,
is even
independent
worse.
source of electricity. A modern nuclear reactor generates enough electricity from 1 kilogram of fuel to power an average American household for But rather than dying, nuclear power has evolved from an all-time high of 18% in 1996 to 11% today, and is expected to drop further in the next decade. What happens to the great promise of this technology? a series of nuclear power relies
thiếu
on
đam
the
quá.
fission of uranium nuclei and a controlled chain reaction that reproduces the
fuck?
splitting in many more nuclei. The atomic nucleus is densely
So
packed
weak.
with protons
Ai
and
da.
neutrons
So
bound by a
weak.
powerful nuclear force. Most uranium atoms have a total of 238 protons and neutrons, but roughly 1 in every 140 lacks neutrons, and this lighter
Once I
isotope
will
is less
try
tightly
to
bound.
use.
Compared to its
was
more
that?
abundant cousin, a strike by a neutron easily splits the U-235 nuclei into lighter radioactive elements called fission products, in addition to 2 to 3 neutrons, gamma rays, and a few neutrinos. During fission, some neutrinos transform powers the vast neutrons. Some of them strike one nuclei. Fission results in a second, larger collection of neutrons. If this second generation of neutrons strike more uranium nuclei, more fission results in an even larger collection. And so on. But inside a nuclear reactor, firing a nuclear reactor is cleared using control rockets made of elements that capture excess neutrons and keep their number in check. With a controlled chain reaction, a reactor grows out steadily and stably. The neutron wedge chain reaction is a potent process driving the
Wow, dead.
but there's a catch that can result in unique demands on neutrons. Turns out most of the neutrons emitted from fission have too much kinetic energy to be captured by the nucleus. The fission and the chain reaction fizzles out. The first nuclear reactor built in Chicago used graphite as a moderator to scatter and slow down neutrons just enough to increase their capture of fission. Moderators is commonly used to purify water
Ôi,
as
ngu luôn.
but the scattered neutrons are
Dù
still a little
dù
too
ulti
fast.
đấy là ngu luôn.
To compensate and keep up the chain reaction, the concentration of
It looks like I
U-235
don't
is
really need the
enriched
damage
to
when I do
4
that
to 7
rotation.
times its natural abundance. Today,
Why?
enrichment
Because
is often
where
done by
ammonia?
passing a
Where?
gaseous uranium
Are you gonna
fusion
sponsor
through
me?
centrifuges to separate lighter U-235 from heavier U-238. But the same process can be continued to highly enrich U-235 30 times
Oh shit,
its
that's
natural abundance
way too far.
and create an explosive chain reaction in a bomb. Methods like centrifuge processing
Yeah, it is.
must be carefully regulated to limit the spread. Remember, only a fraction of these fission raising the speed up
Wow, wow, look at the damage.
power goes into the kinetic energy of the fission products. Those are captured inside the reactor as heat. Water. This heat is eventually used to drive the turbine generator. Just outside the reactor, water flow is critical not only to create electricity, but also to regulate the shredding type the melting point. If water flow stops because a pipe carrying the grid pumps the fission fail, the uranium picks up full during the nuclear meltdown, radioactive gases escape into the reactor. If the reactor fails to hold them, concrete is the last line of defense. Radioactive gas is too high, containment fails, and the gases escape spreading as far as radioactive fission products in these vapors eventually decompose. While some make it in seconds, others take thousands of years.
Motherfuck.
The greatest challenge for a nuclear reactor is to safely contain these products and keep them from harming humans or the environment. Containment doesn't stop matter once the nucleus is used up. In fact, storage bottles. Some spent fuel is removed from the reactors and stored in pits of water to clear the waste and block the emissions. Radiated fuel is fission products, and plutonium. Radioactive material. This mix must be isolated from the environment so it has all safe use. Many countries propose long-term storage. 24,000
Bú rồi, đủ má.
Today, many nuclear power plants sit on their
勝利
waste
の
instead,
外貨が響か
storing
ん
them
無礼な散
indefinitely
々罪
in
の名におい
arson.
て完成
Apart from radioactivity, there's an even greater danger with spent fuel,
アンコールの時間
sustained chain reactions, and chemical waste to make
Nhìn
bombs.
vậy nhìn chán đời chưa kìa.
Storing
Tay này
spent
có đi đâu
fuel
không?
is thus not only a safety
勝
risk
利
for
の
the
外貨が
environment,
響かん
but also
無礼
a
な散
security
々
risk
手を
for
はず
nations.
野菜のイカズチ雷電の鼓舞早く
Who should be the one to guard it? Scientists from the early years of inside the atom
ステージに戻る
as an explosive bomb and potential. But their success about the technology not so industrial limits. Mining the sun is
夜の権限
expensive and risky engineering.
野菜のイカズチステージが始まるわ強風
Má lại bú tiếp rồi.
私に服従しなさい雷電千鳥バットン
On a cold winter night in 1916, Felix Yusupov anxiously prepared to pick up his dinner guest. If all went as planned, his guest would be dead by morning, though 4 others had already tried and failed to finish him off. The Russian monarchy
Là
was
vì
on
kiểu
the
quy tên nó
brink
có
of
sẵn rồi, không cần
collapse,
dùng cái
and
đấy
to
nữa.
Yusupov and his fellow aristocrats, the holy
Nếu biết tại
man
sao.
they'd invited to dinner was the single cause of it.
Yeah.
But
Abonia
who
is the
was
best.
it? And how could a single monk
Obviously.
be to blame for the fate of an empire?
You see, this is Red
Rasputin
Lotus,
began
and
his life
HT is already sucked.
born in 1869 to a peasant family. He might have lived a life of obscurity in his small village, if not for his conversion to the Russian Orthodox Church in the 1890s. Inspired by the humbled monks that wandered endlessly from holy site to holy site, he spent years on pilgrimages across Russia. On his travels, strangers were captivated by Rasputin's magnetic presence. Some even believed he had mystical gifts of prediction and healing. Despite Rasputin's heavy drinking, petty theft, and promiscuity, his reputation as a monk quickly spread beyond Siberia and attracted both lay people and powerful Orthodox clergy. When he finally reached the
Là tên đấy điểm cao nhất.
capital of Petersburg, Rasputin used his charisma and connections to win favor with the imperial family's spiritual advisor. In November 1905, Rasputin was finally introduced to Russian Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas and his wife
Rồi, xong
Alexandra
sai luôn.
devoutly believed in the Orthodox Church, as well as in mysticism and supernatural powers. And this Siberian holy man had them
Thế chứ sao
transfixed.
lại không?
It was a particularly tumultuous period for Russia and their family. The monarchy was barely came into control after the revolution of 1905. Their political struggles were only intensified by personal turmoil. Alexei, the heir to the throne, had a life-threatening blood disease called hemophilia. When Alexei suffered a severe
Thế như ông nào đấy bảo là dùng 3 set candle vậy.
advised his parents to reject treatment from doctors. Alexei's health improved, cementing the royal family's belief that Rasputin had magical healing powers and guaranteeing his privileged place on the royal court. Today, we know that the doctors had prescribed aspirin, a drug that worsens hemophilia. After this incident, Rasputin made a prophecy. If he died, or the royal family deserted him,
Má
both
đét.
their son and their crown would soon be gone. Outside the royal family, people had mixed views on Rasputin. On one hand, peasants regarded him as one of their own, amplifying their often unheard voice to the monarch. But nobles and clergymen came to despise his
Nào đấy biết đâu.
Rasputin never ceased his scandalous behavior, and they were skeptical of his so-called powers and thought he was corrupting the royal family. By the end of World War I, they were convinced the only way to maintain order was to eliminate this shame of a holy man. With this conviction, Yusupov began to plot Rasputin's assassination. Though the exact details remain mysterious, our best guess at how it all unfolded comes from Yusupov's memoirs. He served Rasputin a number of pastries, believing they contained cyanide. But unbeknownst to Yusupov, one of his co-conspirators had a change of heart and substituted the poison with a harmless substance. To Yusupov's shock, Rasputin ate them without effect.
Why did I
In desperation, he shot Rasputin at point-blank range, but Rasputin recovered, punched his attacker, and fled. Yusupov and his accomplices pursued him, finally killing Rasputin with a bullet to the forehead and dumping his body in the Malanevka River. But far from stabilizing the monarchy's authority, Rasputin's death enraged the peasantry. Just as Rasputin prophesied, his murder was swiftly followed by that of the royal family. Whether the downfall of the Russian monarchy was a product of the monk's curse or the result of political tension decades in the making, well, we may never know. To learn more about the revolution that toppled the Russian Tsar and his family's regime, check out this video on one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin, subversive hero or murderous.
Má nét. Má em đánh nữa.
In history versus Lenin.
What
Order, order. Now, wasn't it your fault that the band broke up?
Your Honor, this is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin, the rabble-rouser who helped overthrow the Russian Tsar Nicholas II in 1917 and founded the Soviet Union, one of the worst dictatorships of the 20th century.
The Tsar was a bloody pirate, other than the masses toiled in slavery.
This is rubbish. Serfdom had already been abolished in 1861.
Placed myself at once. The factory bosses treated the people far worse than the former landlords. And unlike the landlords, they were always there. Russian foreigners paid for 11 hours. Was paid all the workers.
The Tsar Nicholas made laws to protect the workers.
He reluctantly did the bare minimum to avert
Má nét em đánh nữa.
and even there he failed. Remember what
Này không hướng đánh cức kìa. Thôi sủi, mai đánh. Dít, sủi. Dít. Time to go touch myself to get the inspiration to mount on this boss again. Yeet, see you tomorrow.